When Trump's vote gets underestimated a third time over, I'm telling you, all these Zakaria type liberals, they knew that Trump was winning, and yet they made it seem to their audiences that he isn't, because there is a massive liberal media bias against Trump.
In this election, I never argued that Kamala would win. It's ironic they're using a clip from 8 years ago. The truth is this election I always said was too close to call. It appears that Trump has won by about 1.5% of the popular vote, which is less than Biden won by, less than Obama won by. It's one of the smaller victories.
What do you make of what our viewers should expect from a second Trump presidency?
It's a personality more than a program. The lesson he has taken from the first Trump administration is you need people who are absolutely loyal to you.
Looked at in a global arc, the results that we've seen over the past several months suggest a massive pushback against incumbents. Where does that place Modi's victory?
The first thing fundamentally one has to say is India does not have a two-party system. Anti-incumbency vote often got divided between 2 or 3 major parties. He has somehow managed to maintain the sense of trust, somebody who came from outside the world of political elites.
Biggest question in the world right now is what is likely to happen over the next 4 years with Donald Trump in the helm.
While we have these very colorful changes in America, Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden, US policy toward India for the last 25 years has been remarkably consistent and upward moving. Trump has always said he loves Modi, so I think there will be a continuation to create an Asia where you have less dependence on China and greater interdependence with India.
Hello and welcome. We're in Goa currently, and I am delighted to be joined in person by the world's foremost foreign affairs guru, Fareed Zakaria. Thank you very much, Mr. Zakaria. It's always so nice to see you in person and talk to you.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Rahul.
The biggest question in the world right now is what is likely to happen over the next 4 years with Donald Trump in the helm as the 47th president of the United States. Of the clues that Trump has given since his historic victory, what do you make of what our viewers should expect from a second Trump presidency?
It's hard to tell because Trump really, more than any president I can remember, really perhaps more than any world leader, it's a personality more than a program. It's his personality that determines everything. Does he feel like he likes another foreign leader? Does he feel like there's a deal here where he's going to look good? It's all about that. So with that caveat, because you really have to say that, would anyone have guessed that in the first Trump term, Donald Trump, the great hardline Republican hawk, would fall in love with Kim Jong-un, the dictator of North Korea? Why did he do that? I think somebody convinced him that if he got a deal with the North Koreans, he would win the Nobel Peace Prize. So it became really more about him than about, a realistic appraisal of what the prospects for a deal were. I think what we can say is this. Trump in the first term came to office by his own admission, and certainly the admission of his closest lieutenants. He didn't expect to win. So he comes into office and he essentially takes on the Republican establishment. If you remember, his first chief of staff was Reince Priebus, the head of the Republican National Committee. He takes on the former CEO of Exxon as his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, because he thought he knew the world, things like that. That is not what Trump 2 is going to be. Trump has realized that all those people were not ultimately loyal to him. He appointed a lot of generals in the first Trump term. And I think he discovered that those generals, when he would order them to do something, if they believed it was not in the Constitution, not legal, or maybe even violated certain ethical codes, they wouldn't do it. So it seems to me that the lesson he has taken from the first Trump administration is you need people who are absolutely loyal to you and whose loyalty would not make them question your directives, even if they are ethical concerns they have or constitutional concerns. So at one level, it's a little worrying, but it tells you who you're getting. This is going to be a much more full-throated Trumpian group. And what do we know about the appointments he's made? Marco Rubio is a very talented politician. The National Security Advisor, again, a serious guy who has foreign policy experience. They're both very hawkish on China. And I think that in general, what you'd have to guess from what you're seeing is that there will be a pretty tough policy on China. And you know, what's also happened is there's been a broad shift over the last 10 years in the United States in the kind of strategic elite's perception of China. Because in a classic, you know, pattern in international relations where each side, you know, does one thing which causes the other, they have watched Chinese maneuvers and felt that the Chinese are essentially building a military that is designed to defeat the American Navy in Taiwan, designed to really replace the United States as the leading power in the Indo-Pacific. So I think you're going to see a much more hawkish policy on China. Trump has always said he loves Modi, so I think there will be a continuation of the policy toward India. The truth is, while we have these very colorful changes in America, and if you think about it, you went from, you know, Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump to Biden. U.S. policy toward India for the last 25 years has been remarkably consistent and upward moving. And so I think what you're likely to see with India is the continuation of that upward moving trajectory, closer and closer cooperation, greater and greater determination to create an Asia where you have less dependence on China and greater interdependence with India.
There is a conspiracy theory which does the round in society in general, which says that there is a liberal media bias against the likes of Donald Trump. And you may have seen this one video which Elon Musk shared. You feature very briefly in it where you're saying there's no way Trump can win. And when Trump's vote gets underestimated a third time over, they say, you know, I'm telling you, all these Zakaria type liberals, they knew that Trump was winning, and yet they made it seem to their audiences that he isn't, because there is a massive liberal media bias against Trump. And that feeling gets reinforced because in the end, from the outside, even though the numbers suggest it was a close election, but from the outside it seems Trump won easy. So how do you, as a practitioner and as a pundit, respond to this? Because they're saying, hum to bata hi rahe the, ye sab biased hain inke khilaf.
So in this election, I never argued that Kamala would win. It's ironic they're using a clip from 8 years ago. But the truth is this. This election, I always said, was too close to call. Privately, honestly, I did think Trump would win. I thought very narrowly. Let's look at the final results. And it appears that Trump has won by about 1.5% of the popular vote, which is less than Biden won by, less than Obama won by, less even than George W. Bush won by in 2004. So it's not an overwhelming victory. It's a solid victory, but it's one of the smaller victories. If you tally it on American presidential elections, I think it comes something like 50 out of 60. I think that 2016, I definitely thought Trump would not win, partly because, you know, if you looked at the polls, Hillary Clinton was leading by 7, 8 points. The really interesting question is not that there's a liberal media bias about this. That's silly. It's that there is a persistent problem in polling which is not picking up Trump voters. And there are 2 or 3 reasons why this seems to happen. One is that Trump has upended the political coalitions. He appeals to some people who are new. He turns off some people who used to be reliably Republican. You know, the party has changed so much. It used to be the party of the rich and the upper middle class. It's now the party of the poor and the working class. So in that midst of that, when you're polling and you make these adjustments, because obviously you're polling a sample, and then you're trying to adjust, you know, I have too few blacks, I have too many women, and you adjust. In that adjustment, are you missing these shifts that are taking place? The second is that Trump voters seem to be shy. They use that phrase, meaning they are less willing to talk to pollsters. They are less willing to tell pollsters whom they're going to vote for. And in that context, you're getting some underrepresentation. There's a very interesting analysis that was done by somebody, a Republican pollster, who decided to ask the question differently. he said, not whom are you going to vote for, who do you think your neighbors are voting for? And he got a much higher response for Trump than, so in other words, people are saying, I don't want to admit to you that I'm voting for Trump, but all my neighbors are voting for Trump. So maybe there needs to be more clever calculation around this. But I would say that to me, the lesson actually, which is a very healthy lesson, is that polling is a very imperfect science. I mean, when I was getting my PhD in social science, we had to do a lot of this kind of statistical analysis. And I was always conscious of, because what assumptions you make massively affects the, are you assuming that you need to adjust for non-college educated black men? Because it turns out that that's a very significant group who trended a little bit toward Trump. Well, if you didn't make that adjustment, because you can adjust for 1,000 categories, the ones you choose are the ones that determine. So it's a little bit more of a kind of technical problem. Now, I don't want to pretend, by the way, the media is generally liberal. That's true. Just as academia is generally liberal. Just as, by the way, consulting firms are generally liberal. The big divide in America right now is college education. If you have the single strongest predictor of who you voted for in this last 3 elections has been, do you have a college degree or do you not? If you have a college degree, you're much more likely to have voted for Kamala Harris. If you don't have a college degree, you're much more likely to have voted for Donald Trump. So of course, the professions that are, that have lots of people with college degrees are going to skew left.
Trump's promises, he wants to make America great again, and part of his pitch is to increase trade tariffs with other countries to the extent of about 20%, which could include India, and 60% he says against China. How much of this is likely to come through?
Trump
how much of this is maneuvering and posturing, and how much will he actually ram through?
Trump is mostly an opportunist and a practical political deal maker. I think that a lot of what he says you have to take with a grain of salt. And so some of his programs will fade away, I think. The one thing about tariffs is, and that general protectionism, is that Trump has held this view forever. All the other views have come and gone. His first political statement was in 1985 when he was a candidate, when he was a real estate developer. He was a candidate for nothing. He took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, and it was an ad saying the Japanese, in those days, that was the fear, the Japanese were going to take over the world. The Japanese are, are engaging in vicious, unfair trade. We should not be taking this lying down. We should slap tariffs on them. We should do all this kind of thing. And by the way, the Europeans are also terrible because they don't pay us enough for our security. So those are the 2 things he's always believed, particularly on tariffs. So it's hard for me to believe that nothing will happen. I mean, this is a guy who's said many, many times that he's going to put 10% tariffs, or sometimes he says 20 on everybody, 60% on China. I think there is an element of threat and bluff, but there will be some tariffs. I think there's no question there'll be some tariffs, and he's singled out India as having very high tariffs, which is true. India is probably the most protectionist large economy in the world today. So as somebody who basically believes that India would do much better with more open trade and would lift many, many people out of poverty if you were to be more integrated into the world economy, I hope that Trump actually has the effect is that he threatens India with tariffs. India decides in response they have to do a deal. Part of the deal is Indian tariffs go down. That would be great. But the overall effect of Trump tariffs will be probably greater protectionism in the world, less trade, less economic interaction, which in the long run is not a great thing.
Let's spend a moment on the US-China dynamic. He's threatening 60% tariffs, even if it isn't quite to that extent, it's lesser, but there will be more fragmentation of that equation. How does that impact countries like India? How do you see US-China play out over the next 4 years, particularly looked at from India's lens?
Look, for India, this is a golden opportunity. Trump is almost certainly going to put higher tariffs on China than anyone else. Even if they come up with a deal, I think there will be more tariffs on China. But even beyond that, American business in general is on a long de-risking process away from China. If you're an American CEO and you have, your only supplier is China, you are actively seeking to change that. Every American's here. If you have 70% of your production, you're trying to get it to 50%. So the arrow is only moving in one direction. So far, to be fair, to be honest, India has not benefited that much from it. The major countries that have benefited are Vietnam, Mexico, a little bit Malaysia. India has not yet been able to be the manufacturing powerhouse that could replace China. And I don't have to tell you, there are all kinds of problems, regulatory problems, labor problems, why India is not a manufacturing powerhouse. And it still isn't. There is some hope in some areas. The Apple iPhone production is a very promising sign, but there are all kinds of problems. The simplest one, for example, is because India is so protectionist, a lot of manufacturing is now actually assembly. So you have to import intermediate goods from other countries, and India has very high tariffs on those. So until that's all lowered and regularized, it's hard. But now, if this push gets even further, you're going to need to find scale, because if you're going to get your production in China from 100% down to 80%, you can fill that 20% with Vietnam. But if you're going from 100 or 80% now to 40%, you need scale, you need volume. Only India can potentially provide that. So it's a real golden opportunity. And what India should be trying to do is not so much go for the very high-end chips and things like that, because you're going to be able to do one or two signature projects like that. But India is a poor country. It has a per capita GDP of 2,700, 2,800. Where it can excel is in large-scale manufacture of everything, because it has cheap labor, it has land, it has the capacity to organize this all. So if it were to take this opportunity, India can find a way to become a manufacturing powerhouse that it has still not yet been.
Looked at in a global arc, the results that we've seen over the past several months suggest a massive pushback against incumbents. Where does that place Modi's victory? I mean, he came down from 303 to 240, but to me it looks that much more incredible when all incumbents are being wiped out, including Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, for the Prime Minister to be able to ensure, with the reduced majority and with coalition partners, to stay on in power. How do you see this push that we're seeing globally against incumbency?
Yeah, the global anti-incumbent feeling is extraordinary. There's a data analysis done in Europe where they took the voting patterns over the last 120 years, and there has never been a year like this one, this last 12 months, where every incumbent party that was up for election in the industrialized world lost. And pretty much every incumbent party throughout the world suffered significant setbacks or was voted out of office. Modi is probably the most important exception. I think there are one or two others, but is the most important exception. Now, why did it happen? The first thing fundamentally one has to say is India does not have a two-party system. And if there had been a two-party system where every BJP person was up against one non-BJP MP, it is likely that the BJP would have lost power. Because what happened in India is the anti-incumbency vote often got divided between two or three major parties. So that's number one. But the second is, you're right, Modi has bucked the trend because I think he is personally very popular, even though there's a feeling of anti-incumbency, things have been too chaotic, inflation was high, COVID was not handled well. He has somehow managed to maintain the sense of trust and connection with the Indian people. And it's because at the end of the day, Modi is still seen by Indians as something of an outsider. He's seen as somebody who came from outside the world of political elites, and which is true. He is really, in many ways, the first genuine outsider to become Prime Minister of India. And that, it's a testament to his skill that despite being Prime Minister for 10 years, he's still viewed that way. But that, I think, is the key to the places where you have seen success. So if you look at the United States over the last 20 years, there have been two figures who have dominated American politics, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. They're totally different except in one respect. They're both outsiders to the political system.
Looked at from the outside, what are you making of Modi 3.0? We look at it from inside and very closely, but when you zoom out and see from your perch, How are you seeing Modi 3.0 being different from what we've seen the past 10 years?
The most interesting thing, which was sort of predictable, I suppose, is that you see a renewed determination and emphasis on getting the politics right. I think Modi viewed the dramatic loss of his majority as a wake-up call. So if you look at the various state elections, the BJP is utterly organized, determined, driven. They're outspending the opposition by even more. I mean, maybe they were outspending them by 5-1. Now they're outspending them by 10-1. So you see the political determination of Modi coming through very strongly. But in policy terms, actually, what I'm struck by is the continuity. Modi is, doubling down on the growth agenda. He is continuing to try to push infrastructure, all those things. So, which is actually very welcome, because I think what you're seeing is a much greater sense that, there's not the elections did not result in him saying, okay, I'm going to abandon all this because it might be disruptive, or I'm going to entirely go to pandering, populist politics of giving away freebies. It's not that. There is a real growth agenda, and I think India benefits from it. On the social side, in terms of Muslims, minorities, rule of law, judiciary, again, I don't see much change one way or the other. So in a way, with Modi, you see what you get. And people who are hoping you'll get a softer, gentler Modi on issues like minorities, I don't see that, but I don't see any. He seems to have a formed view politically in that way, and it's playing out.
For the past 4.5 years, the Indian and the Chinese armies were eyeball to eyeball along the line of actual control. And then before the Kazan SCO summit, the PLA announced that it would pull back. The Indians had held their ground, and when I speak to officials in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of External Affairs, they can't quite explain why the PLA agreed to pull back. I mean, they say we don't even know why they came in. We just held our ground, did what we had to, stood firm, and now they're going back, and thank God for that. Looked at from your lens, why do you think Xi Jinping, because I don't think the PLA could have taken the decision on their own, why do you think Xi Jinping has chosen to improve relations with India at this juncture?
It's a very good question. Nobody really knows the answer. As you say, nobody really understood why the PLA pushed in the Himalayas as they did in the first place. So one has to get, because the puzzle is this, Rahul, which is Xi Jinping has had a more aggressive policy, foreign policy, since he came into power. But it was mostly directed at staunch allies of the United States or the United States itself. US, Australia, Taiwan, those were the areas. But he also, you saw this incursion in India. There's a part of me that thinks there is something going on in that area, which is in the conception of the hardliners in Beijing, is vital to their national security or to their sense of national unity. Remember, this idea of national unity is very important for the Chinese. And the area, as you know, is essentially part of Tibet, and Tibet is part of their conception of, the unity of China is centrally involves the idea of control of Tibet, control of Mongolia, control of Taiwan. These are very core issues, because they have solved, I think I'm right in saying this, they have solved 15 of the 16 border disputes they have with their neighbors. The one they have not solved is India. So there's some issue that for them is very sensitive. And so I think what happened in the incursion in the first place is it might have been some misunderstanding or miscalculation. The local commanders went forward, but they were not willing to pull back. They were not willing to compromise. They were not willing to. Now, why has he changed? I think Xi has realized that his whole wolf warrior diplomacy has failed. Look, they tried in Australia to blackmail the Australians with the sort of 14 demands. It went nowhere. The Australians didn't budge. They tried in the Philippines became more pro-American. They've tried in Southeast Asia in general. it hasn't worked. They tried in Europe. The Europeans are more aligned with the US strategy toward China. And I think, there's a fundamental misunderstanding the Chinese have of their rise. Maybe they look at their rise and they look at America and say, America rose to power and just became more and more influential. America's rise is very unusual because America is surrounded by two vast oceans and two very weak neighbors. So America's rise does not, essentially, inherently threaten anyone. And America is often seen as far away, this far-off power occasionally comes in, restores the balance of order, interferes depending on your point of view, but it goes back. China is rising in the middle of a very crowded continent. Right next to China is India, is Japan, is Vietnam, and as China rises, it makes countries like that very anxious and insecure. And so I think they've handled their rise completely wrong. They should have been much more accommodating. That was the Deng Xiaoping model. And maybe there's a course correction taking place. But you'll notice it's a fairly modest course correction. I mean, I would have thought Xi would have tried. I mean, if I was Xi Jinping, I would say the way you outfox the Americans is you make closer and closer deals with India. And Modi was not opposed to that when Xi Jinping came to power. People often forget that Modi's first use of the word, multilateral, not multi-aligned foreign policy. When he started talking about a multi-aligned foreign policy, India had very good relations with China, and many people interpreted that to mean, I'm going to have good relations with America and with China. The Chinese squandered that, and so if they could have found a way to manage to have closer economic and technology and political ties with India, that would throw the biggest spanner in the wrench in America's strategy in Asia. But they're still not able to do it because I think she still at some level believes, look, we are the leading power in Asia. We should be given the respect we deserve. Other nations should be kowtowing to us. Not literally in the old Chinese sense, but should be paying us deference. And of course, India is never going to pay China deference.
Trump's victory has an impact on everyone, but the one leader who was looking most carefully was Zelensky, because they were very worried about the impact of a Trump presidency on the future course of the Russia-Ukraine war. We've seen Zelensky now speak about the possibility of some kind of a political solution. Do you see this war end in the next several months? Or pause?
I think that there's a good prospect that there's a deal to be had. And the truth is it was already moving toward that. Because over the last several months, it has become clear that the Russians are not going to be displaced from the 20% of Ukraine that they hold. The Ukrainians have made very brave, valiant efforts. They've dislodged them a little bit from the positions that they held in that first flurry in 2022 when they took over parts of Ukraine. But Crimea, the core pieces of Donbass that they hold, they are going to hold. Now, on the other hand, it's also worth saying, the Russians have made no advances either. The Russians have not been able to take much more of Ukraine.
But that could change unless Zelensky's army keeps getting weapons and supplies.
So that's why I say there's a deal to be had, which is if Trump makes clear to Putin, look, there's a deal to be had roughly along the lines we are at now. We can freeze the lines now. But if you try to make more advances, I will keep funding the Ukrainians.
But is he interested in funding the Ukrainians? I mean, you'd like to hope
but that's why I say there's a deal to be had if Trump wants the deal. But the deal does involve the threat to Putin that he will keep funding Zelensky. So here's the way I think about it. There's a great opportunity for Donald Trump to say, I made the deal, Joe Biden didn't, I made it, it happened on my watch, and
I ended the war.
I'm the great deal maker, I ended the war. But it does require him to be tough on Putin. Now, on the other hand, I think what you're hinting at, Rahul, is he doesn't seem to like the Ukrainians. Remember, he tried to blackmail Zelensky in the first term, and Zelensky, by the way, did not get blackmailed. Don't forget, that's a very important thing that people sometimes forget, which is Zelensky defied Trump in that, and Trump must not have liked that. A lot of people around him His son, for example, is openly anti-Ukrainian. Tulsi is openly anti-Ukrainian. So, there's two conflicting strategies here. If I were the Ukrainians, I would try to focus on this idea that Trump can be the peacemaker. He can make the deal. But for the deal to be made, there has to be a real threat. If he does that, as I say, you freeze the lines, and you have to give Ukraine some security guarantee. That's the other part, which I wonder about where Trump would be. Because if you don't give them a security guarantee, Ukraine will collapse, because nobody is going to invest in a country that you think the Russians could go back in 2 years. Even Ukrainian young men who have fled won't come back. In fact, you might have more exodus out of Ukraine, because if there's a peace deal, the Ukrainians will have to lift martial law and they'll lift the mandatory draft and things like that, and the young men will leave. So you'll have a basket case in Ukraine. So the way to end this war is clear. The question is, it does require that Trump be tough on Putin. He'll also have to be tough on Zelensky and say, look, you've got to take this deal.
Putin thinks of all of this. He could say, I don't think Trump's going to keep funding Ukraine. I just need to hold my ground, and maybe I can finish off the job I started.
Right. So if Putin thinks that, then you have to keep funding. The key is you have to keep funding, because so far what we've seen is, if the US and Europe continue to support Ukraine, they're willing to fight, they're willing to die, and they've done remarkably well. Remember, Russia is 10 times the economy of Ukraine's, 4 times the population. And it's right next door. This is not some faraway imperial conquest. It's right next door. And they've still not been able to move beyond those lines that they've held. They've still not been able to take Kyiv. They've not been able to take the other major cities. Ukraine is able to export all its grain through the Black Sea. So if you consider the mismatch, the Ukrainians, as David, have really stood up to a Goliath. And the Russian economy is suffering enormously. The other leverage that Trump has over Putin is the sanctions are very tough. Now, being an oil exporting economy, Russia will always have some cash, and they can always build their army. But they're doing it really at the cost of the rest of society and the rest of the Russian economy, which is really in a kind of increasingly primitive state, because they don't have access to technology, they don't have access to capital markets. So there's a big upside for Putin to end the war.
Iran has threatened to strike back against Israel after the missile strikes. Nothing's happened so far, and now Donald Trump is in power. Where do you see the Israel-Iran conflict go from here? Will they just keep threatening each other but not really striking and escalating? Or could Benjamin Netanyahu say, here's my chance to go in and once and forever attempt to alter the map of West Asia or change the configuration?
It's very intelligent that you're asking it about the Israel-Iran, because that's the central dynamic at play right now. The Gaza thing is now basically over, and it's a separate issue. It's what Israel should do with the occupied territories, how it should handle the Palestinians, and just put that aside, both politically and humanitarian catastrophe that it is. What is going on in the north is the central strategic game. The Iranians have been trying to play a game through their proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Syria and Iran, and Hamas, of putting Israel on edge, but also putting the Gulf Arabs on edge. They allowed the Houthis to attack Saudi Arabia's oil facilities. The Israelis have decided enough. We are going to re-establish deterrence, and we are going to strike hard, both at Hezbollah and at Iran. And what they discovered was that Iran and Hezbollah were much weaker than people realized. And they have, I think, very effectively re-established deterrence, where they've destroyed Hezbollah to a large extent militarily, though politically it remains a very powerful organization. And what they've shown and they've exposed is that Iran is a paper tiger. They've now destroyed all of Iran's air defenses. All, by the way, Russian-built air defenses. And India, please take note. The value of Russian kit is not very high these days. They were able to, in a few hours, destroy the entire Russian-built Iranian air defenses. So Iran is now naked. I think Israel is happy with where things are now, because what they're, in a sense, saying to Iran is, you do something else. You take more provocative moves. One of your proxies strikes us again, and we can destroy your military facilities, your cities, your nuclear research labs. So in a way, it's up to the Iranians. And the Iranians have said they're going to strike back at Israel. But they've said it a while ago. They haven't done anything yet. I think that's where the game is. If they were to strike, the Israelis could very easily absolutely destroy either Iran's military bases or even parts of their nuclear facility. For the nuclear stuff, they need American bombs. Their bombs are not powerful enough. But, I mean, they're special bunker busting bombs they need that they do not have access to right now. But they could set Iran back very, very substantially. So I think what this whole episode has showed, Israel is the region's superpower now. It is the military superpower of the Middle East. And by the way, it's the technology superpower of the Middle East. And a new deterrence has been established between Israel and Iran.
How weak is the Iranian state in your lens? If Benjamin Netanyahu were to push and try and orchestrate regime change, I mean, there is discontent. We've seen that in all the riots and the protests. Would they be able to pull it off, or would it be a very foolish mistake?
The thing about dictatorships is that they seem eternal until the day they collapse, and then it seems inevitable, and you can't believe it went on for so long. So I'm very hesitant. It's a tough dictatorship. But my own sense is that the Iranian regime has always been able to mix repression with patronage in a way that gives it a certain stability. Iran is a very traditional society, religious society. The Shia clergy it's very different from a Sunni state where the clergy have a certain kind of political role and respect. And you can see this even in just by looking at Iraq next door. In Iraq, which is a free democracy, the Shia tend to vote for parties that are very closely aligned with Shia religious groups, with Shia religious figures like Muqtada al-Sadr and things like that. So, it's not surprising that the Ayatollahs have some support. I don't think it's a majority by any means, but if you're a dictatorship, and in the rural areas, among old people, among more religious people, you have some support. Then you dole out patronage, and you increase your support. And then you crack down hard on all these urban liberals. That seems to have been the formula that has kept the Iranian regime in power, and my gut is that it's still a workable formula. As I say, you never know with the dictatorship, but what I will say for sure is we have now had many experiments at regime change in the Middle East in the last 20 years. Iraq, Afghanistan, if you think of that as the greater Middle East, Libya, Syria. It's a very messy proposition. Regardless of whether it succeeds as it did in Iraq, as it fails as it did in Syria, you have hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions, get displaced, hundreds of thousands die. What you end up with often not that much better than what you started with. So I would say to anyone thinking of regime changes in Iran as a strategy, and remember, this is a big country. This is not some small. Just be careful what be careful what you wish for.
This has been a masterclass in foreign affairs. Thank you very much for enlightening us with your insights and very sharp observations about where we are. And you've spoken a lot about where we are likely to head. So it's always great to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rahul. Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Curtains have come down on the high voltage contest in Maharashtra. 48 hours from now, the state of Maharashtra will go to polls on the last day of campaigning. Rahul Gandhi did a press conference in Mumbai saying, "Ek hai to safe hai," leveling this charge against the BJP and the PM. The BJP hit back, calling this low-level theatrics.
इनका नारा मोदी जी ने दिया है और बिल्कुल सही नारा है। एक है तो सेफ है। सवाल है सेफ कौन है, सेफ किसका है, एक कौन है, ये सवाल है।
Congress leader Rahul Gandhi mocks Prime Minister Modi's "Ek hai to safe hai" war cry with jibe at Adani's Dharavi slum project. Rahul Gandhi took a sharp dig at Modi, accusing him of prioritizing Gautam Adani over the people of Maharashtra. Rahul fired salvos, saying that as long as Modi is there, Adani is safe.
एक है तो सेफ है, एक कौन है, एक नरेंद्र मोदी जी हैं, अदानी जी हैं, अमित शाह जी हैं। सेफ है तो कौन सेफ है, अदानी जी सेफ हैं।
Rahul was sitting out at Modi's "Ek hai to safe hai" war cry in poll-bound Maharashtra.
कांग्रेस SC, ST, OBC समाज की एक जाति को दूसरे के खिलाफ खड़ा कर रही है। अलग अलग जातियों में टूटने से आप सोचिए कमजोर हो जाएंगे कि नहीं हो जाएंगे। एक है तो हमें एकजुट रहकर कांग्रेस के खतरनाक खेल को नाकाम करना है।
The BJP recollected Bala Saheb Thackeray's Chota Popat jibe at Rahul Gandhi, adding that Rahul is seeing treasury everywhere since the Gandhi family is knee-deep in scams.
हिंदुस्तान को लूटने का काम किया है, चाहे नेशनल हेराल्ड का केस हो। तिजोरी के अंदर गांधी परिवार द्वारा लूटा हुआ पैसा बंद और मां बेटे एक्यूज नंबर 1 और एक्यूज नंबर 2 आज बेल पर बाहर है। उन्होंने पोस्टर दिखाया है तो हम भी पीछे नहीं रहेंगे। ये असली पोस्टर तो ये है। क्या है तिजोरी के अंदर?
मोदी जी ने कहा एक है तो सेफ है। अरे मोदी जी का एक है सेफ है का मतलब है एकता है तो हम सब सुरक्षित हैं, सबको साथ लेकर के चल रहे हैं। लेकिन तुम जब बोलते हो एक है तो सेफ है तो तुम्हारे प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस में अगाड़ी के साथी भी नहीं होते, तुम एक ही होते हो और एक होते हो तो ही सेफ होते हो। इस बात को समझ लेना चाहिए।
The BJP also highlighted that it was Uddhav government who gave Dharavi project to Adani and not the Mahayuti. BJP reminded Rahul Gandhi about his brother-in-law Robert Vadra's past visit to Adani facilities. BJP also seized on a video by Telangana Chief Minister Revant Reddy admitting that his government took 100 crore rupees welfare funds donation from Adani.
हर जगह में मोदी जी अदानी को पैसे देते जा रहे हैं, मैं अदानी जेब से पैसे ले रहा हूँ, इतना फर्क है।
One of India's richest billionaires, Gautam Adani, is once again a mega poll flashpoint. Bureau Report, India Today.
This is where we wrap up the news track tonight. For your time and your trust, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you at 8 p.m. tomorrow evening. Till then, from all of us here, goodbye, good night.